Christmas Eve had always been my favorite night of the year. Our family tradition was simple yet sacred. A cozy dinner at home, just the four of us. My wife, Emily, always insisted on setting the table with our best china. Our daughter, Chloe, had folded the napkins into little triangles, and our son, Dylan, had arranged the candles with the seriousness of a seasoned decorator. The house smelled of honey-glazed ham and freshly baked rolls. Outside, the world was silent, blanketed in snow, but inside, laughter and warmth filled every corner. We were halfway through dinner when it happened. 3 sharp knocks at the front door. The sound was jarring, cutting through our conversation like a knife. I glanced at Emily, her brows furrowed, and she set her fork down. "Who could that be?" she whispered. "I'll check," I said, pushing back my chair. Chloe and Dylan exchanged nervous glances. It wasn't often we had uninvited visitors, especially on Christmas Eve. When I opened the door, a man stood there, his frame silhouetted against the snow. He looked to be in his late 40s, his face gaunt and weathered. His coat was torn, and his boots were caked with slush. He held his hands up in a gesture of surrender. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, his voice shaky. "I've had a rough day. My wallet and documents were stolen, and I haven't eaten. Please, can you spare a meal?" My heart twisted. He looked pitiful, like someone life had chewed up and spit out. Emily appeared behind me, her hand resting on my shoulder. Her eyes softened when she saw him. "Of course," she said gently. "Come in." The man hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to be watching. Then, he nodded and stepped inside. We set a plate for him and he ate like a man starving. He barely looked up, shoveling food into his mouth with trembling hands. Chloe and Dylan watched him with wide eyes, clearly unsure of what to make of the stranger. I tried to keep the conversation light, but there was a tension in the air that none of us could ignore. "So, where are you from?" I asked. He paused mid-bite, his gaze darting to me. For a moment, he seemed to consider his answer. "Nowhere in particular," he said finally. "Just passing through." Emily offered him a refill of cider, but he declined. His eyes flicked toward the windows, scanning the dark yard outside. I noticed his fingers drumming against the table, a nervous tick that set me on edge. Then came the first slip. As he reached for his napkin, his sleeve pulled back, revealing a dark stain on his shirt cuff. It wasn't ketchup or wine. It was something darker, thicker. Blood. My stomach churned. I glanced at Emily, who had seen it too. Her face paled, but she said nothing, instead gripping her glass tightly. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The man looked down, quickly tugging his sleeve back into place. "Cut myself earlier. Nothing serious," he said, but his tone was off, too casual, too rehearsed. That's when I remembered the news. Just a few days ago, they'd reported on a serial killer dubbed the Christmas Maniac. He'd been targeting families, gaining their trust before unleashing unimaginable violence. The description fit: a middle-aged drifter, often wearing tattered clothes. My heart began to race. I reached under the table, squeezing Emily's hand. Her eyes met mine, filled with silent understanding. We needed a plan. Dylan excused himself to use the restroom, and Chloe followed, saying she'd help him find something. That left Emily and me alone with the man. He leaned back in his chair, his posture no longer meek but predatory. "You've been very kind," he said, his lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Not many people would take in a stranger." "It's Christmas," Emily replied, her voice tight. "We believe in helping those in need." His smile widened, and for the first time I saw it. a glint of malice in his eyes. "That's what I love about families like yours," he said. "So trusting, so predictable." Before I could react, he lunged. He grabbed a knife from the table, his movements fast and deliberate. Emily screamed, and I shoved my chair back, crashing into the wall. But just as he raised the knife, there was a deafening bang. Chloe stood in the doorway holding my old hunting rifle. Her hands shook, but her aim was steady. "Drop it!" she shouted, her voice trembling but strong. The man froze, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. Slowly, he lowered the knife, setting it on the table. I lunged forward, tackling him to the ground. Emily grabbed the phone and called 911. When the police arrived, they found the man restrained with Christmas lights, courtesy of Dylan's quick thinking. The officers confirmed our worst fears. This was the Christmas maniac. He had been on the run for years, leaving a trail of blood and broken families in his wake. That night, as we sat huddled in the living room, shaken but alive, I couldn't help but marvel at how close we'd come to becoming another statistic. Chloe and Dylan were the real heroes, their quick thinking saving us all. Christmas would never feel the same, but we were together, and that was enough. For years ago, Christmas Eve began like every other one I could remember. Snow blanketed the ground outside, the air was crisp and still, and the warmth of the fireplace filled the house with a cozy glow. I was visiting my childhood home in a quiet, snow-covered suburb. My parents were ecstatic to have me home for the holidays, and the house was decorated to perfection, with twinkling lights and the scent of cinnamon wafting through the air. But what happened that night is something I still struggle to explain. The day had been uneventful. We spent it sipping hot cocoa, wrapping last-minute gifts, and watching old Christmas movies. Around 10 p.m., my parents decided to turn in early, leaving me to my own devices. I wasn't ready for bed yet, so I decided to stay up a bit longer in the living room, scrolling through my phone with the TV playing softly in the background. Outside, the snow was falling gently, and the street was eerily quiet. The houses on our block were spaced far apart, and with most people asleep, the neighborhood felt deserted. It was the kind of silence that made every creak and groan of the house feel amplified. I didn't mind, though. I loved the stillness of winter nights. But that night, the silence wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive. It started with a faint tapping sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind brushing tree branches against the house. I ignored it and kept scrolling, but the sound persisted. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't random, though. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone or something was knocking. I muted the TV and strained my ears. The sound was coming from the front of the house, near the big bay window. My heart began to race as I set my phone down and walked over to the window. Peeking through the heavy curtains, I expected to see a stray branch or maybe an animal. But there was nothing, just the snow-covered yard, illuminated by the soft glow of our Christmas lights. I tried to shake off the unease and went back to the couch, convincing myself it was nothing. But not even 5 minutes later, the tapping started again. This time it was louder, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. Felt like a warning. Gripping my phone tightly, I turned on the flashlight and approached the window again. I hesitated before pulling the curtain back, my breath fogging up the glass. Outside, just beyond the porch, I saw it. A dark figure standing motionless at the edge of the yard. It was too far away to make out any details, but it was unmistakably human. They were tall and thin, dressed in what looked like a long coat. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there watching the house. I froze. My first thought was to call out, but something about the way they stood there, so unnaturally still, made my voice catch in my throat. Instead, I stepped back and let the curtain fall shut. My mind raced. Who would be out there at this hour in the freezing cold? A neighbor? A prankster? The rational part of me tried to dismiss it, but deep down, I felt an icy dread creeping in. I decided to wake my parents, but as I turned toward the stairs, a loud, deliberate knock echoed through the house. Came from the front door. I nearly jumped out of my skin. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. The knock came again, harder this time. My palms were slick with sweat as I inched toward the door, every instinct screaming at me to stay away. Through the peephole I saw nothing. The porch was empty. I'd had enough. I bolted upstairs to wake my dad. He groggily followed me back down, muttering something about raccoons or kids playing a prank. But when he opened the front door, the only thing waiting for us was a single set of footprints in the fresh snow, leading from the street to our porch, and then back to the edge of the yard where the figure had been standing. But the footprints didn't end there. They stopped abruptly, as if the person had simply vanished into thin air. My dad brushed it off, saying it was probably just someone passing through. He locked the door, assured me everything was fine, and went back to bed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. I stayed in the living room, too uneasy to sleep. Around 2 a.m., the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, and the silence became deafening. I lit a few candles and tried to calm myself, but the flickering shadows only made everything feel more sinister. And then I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. This time it was coming from the back of the house, near the kitchen. I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the sound, my hands shaking. As I approached the sliding glass door that led to the backyard, my flashlight flickered and went out. I was plunged into darkness, but I could still see the faint outline of the backyard through the glass. And there, standing just on the other side of the door, was the figure. They were closer now, close enough that I could make out their face. But I wish I hadn't. Their eyes were wide and unblinking, their mouth twisted into a grotesque grin that stretched too far, as if their face didn't quite fit right. They didn't move, didn't speak. They just stared at me, their breath fogging up the glass. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. When I looked again, they were gone. No footprints, no sign they'd ever been there. Just the undisturbed snow, glistening in the moonlight. To this day, I don't know who or what I saw that night. My parents think it was just a bad dream brought on by too much holiday stress. But I know it was real. Every Christmas since then, I felt that same icy dread, as if they're still out there watching, waiting. And every time I hear a faint tapping on the window, I can't help but wonder, is it them, coming back for me? Christmas has always been my favorite time of year. Snow-draped trees, twinkling lights, and the cozy warmth of home. But last Christmas changed all of that for me. What happened that night still haunts me, and I've barely told anyone about it. Maybe if I share the story, I can finally make sense of it, or at least warn someone else. It started on Christmas Eve. I had driven up to my grandmother's cabin in the woods, tucked away in a remote corner of New Hampshire. The cabin was old, its wooden beams creaking with the weight of time. Every year, my family would gather there to celebrate, but this year it was just me. Grandma had passed earlier that spring, and the family decided to skip our usual tradition. I went anyway, partly out of nostalgia and partly because I just needed a quiet escape. The drive was long and cold. Snow was falling in thick, lazy flakes, covering the roads and muffling the world outside. By the time I arrived, the sky had turned an inky black. The cabin stood there, almost hidden by the snow-laden trees, its windows glowing faintly with the light I had left on during my last visit. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. No cars, no distant hum of life, just the whisper of the wind through the trees. The kind of silence that presses against your ears, making every sound, even your own breathing, feel amplified. Inside, the cabin felt smaller than I remembered. The living room was dominated by a stone fireplace, its mantel decorated with dusty garlands and a few old stockings. I set down my bags, lit a fire, and made myself some hot cocoa. As the flames crackled and danced, I started to feel the tension of the drive melt away. The cabin's warmth was comforting, and for a while, I just sat there, staring into the fire, letting memories wash over me. Around 11 p.m., I decided to call it a night. I climbed the narrow staircase to the loft bedroom, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The room was sparse but familiar. A wrought iron bed, an old wooden dresser, and a single window overlooking the snowy forest. I left the curtain open, hoping to wake up to the sight of fresh snow. I don't know what woke me up. At first, I thought it was just the wind rattling the window, but then I heard it again. A soft, deliberate creak, like someone stepping on an old floorboard. My heart froze. I lay there, straining to hear over the pounding of my own pulse. Creak. This time it was louder, closer. It was coming from downstairs. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. 2:13 a.m. The fire had gone out, and the cabin was plunged into darkness, save for the pale moonlight filtering through the window. I reached for the flashlight I had brought with me and crept out of bed. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling. No answer. The stairs felt impossibly long as I descended, each step creaking louder than the last. When I reached the bottom, the living room was empty. The air felt colder, and I noticed that the front door was slightly ajar, a thin layer of snow blowing in from outside. I cursed under my breath and shut the door, locking it this time. I tried to convince myself that I had forgotten to lock it earlier, that the wind had pushed it open. But something didn't feel right. The cabin felt different, like I wasn't alone anymore. That's when I noticed the footprints. They weren't mine. These were bigger, heavier, and leading from the door to the fireplace and back again. My stomach twisted. Gripping the flashlight tightly, I followed the trail, scanning every shadow for movement. The footprints stopped at the fireplace, but there was nothing there, just cold ashes and a faint smell of burnt wood. I was about to head back upstairs when I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible humming, coming from somewhere deeper in the cabin. It wasn't a tune I recognized, just a low, rhythmic hum that made my skin crawl. It was coming from the basement. I didn't even remember there being a basement. The cabin was old, sure, but as far as I knew, it had no lower level. My flashlight flickered as I searched for the source of the sound, and that's when I saw it. A trapdoor, half hidden beneath a worn rug in the corner of the room. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the trapdoor. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, to get in my car and drive far away. But something, curiosity, stupidity, I don't know, pushed me forward. I moved the rug aside and opened the trapdoor. The humming grew louder. The staircase leading down was steep and narrow, the wood damp and slick. I descended slowly, my flashlight barely piercing the thick darkness. The air was damp and smelled of earth and mildew. When I reached the bottom, I found myself in a small, dirt-walled room. Shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of something. I couldn't tell what was inside, and I didn't want to look too closely. In the center of the room was a chair, old and rickety, with thick ropes hanging from its arms and legs. The sight of it made my blood run cold. But what really terrified me was what was behind the chair. A mirror, tall and cracked, reflecting the faint glow of my flashlight. Except, my reflection wasn't right. The figure in the mirror looked like me, but it wasn't. Its eyes were too dark, its smile too wide, and it was moving even though I was standing perfectly still. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The figure tilted its head, as if studying me, and then it whispered something. I couldn't hear the words, but they felt like ice stabbing into my skull. I dropped the flashlight and bolted up the stairs, slamming the trapdoor shut behind me. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, the engine roaring to life as I sped down the snow-covered road. I didn't look back, not even once. I haven't been back to the cabin since. Every so often, though, I'll catch a glimpse of something in reflective surfaces. A window, a mirror, even my phone screen. Just for a second, I'll see that figure staring back at me, smiling that impossibly wide smile. And every time, I hear that faint, low humming, growing louder and louder.